Hi, my name is Tyler Mowery, and welcome to the Writer's Mind Podcast, Episode 1. Okay, so I made a podcast, right? What is this podcast about? What is different about this podcast and other writing podcasts that I'm sure you've heard of? Why should you listen to this one? So I'm here to answer all of that, tell you what this one's going to be about, and why you should be here, and why this is going to be cool, and why this is going to be important, along with my YouTube channel and the other stuff that you know about me. So first off, my YouTube channel is built to give you the basic fundamentals of screenwriting and storytelling, right? If you're coming in and you are new to writing, or you've gone through a class or two or read a book or two and you're not really sure where to go and you want something clear and focused, it's going to be super helpful. That's my YouTube channel. My YouTube channel gives you the basic structure, characters, conflict that a lot of other books are going to give you or film school is going to give you. That's mainly what they are going to be focusing on. And then with my course, for those of you that are aware of my course or have been inside my course takes you to the practical elements of writing, right? So actually getting that screenplay done and how to actually rewrite. So a lot of writers, maybe yourself included, struggle with actually getting that story out onto the page. And once they actually get that story out onto the page, they struggle with how to rewrite and how to look at this 100-page thing that they've written and figure out what's working with it and what's not, and actually fix things in the right way. So that's kind of where the YouTube channel and the course sit. They're very complementary in that way, where the course is giving you that extra, that next step essentially to get that script done, get it rewritten, and improve your skill as a writer. And the YouTube channel is giving you the base level look at writing and storytelling and what you need to be doing to get that base level theory understood. So with this podcast, what I want to now do is talk about what to write about, right? So to essentially talk about why stories exist, why you should write, why stories are important, and what you should write about. See, I think a lot of writers, especially a lot of screenwriters, they get into this zone where they're like, oh, I got to make something super marketable. I got to make something, super quick, super easy, something that people are going to understand and be familiar with. And they go into it with essentially this super marketing focus. And that's not necessarily bad, because obviously you should make money being a writer. I am not somebody that shies away from that idea, or, I don't like the people that say that you should never make money doing art. That's not the case. You should be looking for an income source through your writing. However, that is not, or should not be, the purpose of your writing. That's not why you write. That's not why you wanted to be a writer. You wanted to be a writer because you were impacted by stories. And so, when stories, I talk about this in my YouTube channel a lot, and I talk about this in the course, where stories are guides to living your life. Stories are handling moral, ethical, philosophical dilemmas, and stories are really looking at this extra level of humanity, and it allows us to examine philosophy and psychology and human existence in this in this way that's very natural to how our brains perceive information, right? So we are not necessarily built to just read rational theory on things, right? We actually work by taking a broad understanding of how our brains work, right? So we're not just these logical creatures, we're also these emotional creatures. And there is this personal experiential element to our understanding of the world, right? We're not just, rationalizing our way through life, we are also understanding what are the arguments of human beings against our emotional and real life experience to create our worldview. And this is what stories allow us to get to, right? Stories allow people to make an argument or take a position or take a look at a specific area of life through this lens of having this more whole view of how human beings take in information. So with that being said, this podcast is going to be about thinking. And this podcast is going to be about what you think about. This podcast is going to be about your worldview. This podcast is going to be about reading and learning and cultivating a worldview that is significantly deeper than just being like, oh, I'm trying to write a thriller right now, or I like action movies, so I'm going to make an action script. The idea is that you actually get into this deeper layer where your stories are examining people's belief systems because they are examining your own belief systems. This is something that I talk about with people in my course a lot, where yes, the goal is to build this idea of this deeper level of conflict, something I talk about a lot in my YouTube channel, which is building this deeper level of philosophical conflict into your stories, right? So you want to get to the point rather than just saying, okay, here's a philosophical conflict I want to talk about. You find the philosophical conflicts in your own life, and then you write those into stories to deeply examine them and try to figure out what you legitimately think about certain things. And that is how you end up writing great stories. That's how you end up actually making something that is legitimately impactful for others. So people who only study story theory or people who only write, they are not going to necessarily write something great, because learning story theory and learning how to finish a script and learning how to rewrite, these are skill set elements. They're super important skill set elements, and they're something that you absolutely need to get used to if you are going to be a good writer, but they are not what you write about, right? That's a whole different thing. What you write about is you write about life, and you write about human experience, and you write about your experience, and you write about how you view the world, how you've changed as a person, how you see how life should be lived, essentially, right? So when we think about archetypal stories, a lot of the times they essentially they're holding on to general truths that we have collectively accepted as how life should be lived. Right. So the idea of the knight in shining armor going off to defeat the dragon to get the treasure and save the village, these ideas are kind of foundations of our view on how human beings should exist. We should be courageous in the face of danger. We should help others when they are in need of our help. There is evil in the world. There is, conflict is not necessarily evil. Sometimes conflict is valuable and important to achieving necessary goals, right? Those are so obvious and so innate that even me, sitting here and talking to you about them, you're like, obviously, this is what these stories are about. But you're not conscious of that idea. You are unconsciously understanding that this is what this story is about. And so as you want to become a writer, and as you want to actually take a look at storytelling, then you have to bring all of this to the surface and be aware of how this stuff works. And so within this podcast, this is about being a thinker. And the idea is that you actually become a thinker who then channels your thoughts and your views on life, your views on philosophy, your views on humanity, on yourself, on the world, through the skill set that you've learned by, being on my YouTube channel and listening to other people talk about story theory, and also being practical and actually getting scripts down onto the page and rewriting. So you get closer to that. You get closer to a clarity of thought through rewriting and through the process of shaving away things that aren't working and focusing down on what is working so that you can actually be clear in the argument that you are eventually placing into your story. And I know that a lot of people don't like that idea, right? A lot of people don't like the idea that a specific story has like thematic intention behind it. They don't like the idea that somebody is trying to intentionally say something in a story because they say that that is preachy, right? That makes preachy stories, or, people see what they're trying to say too clearly. But in reality, preachy stories are just bad stories, right? Great stories effectively transfer their worldview to you without you realizing they're doing it, right? Because what happens is when you're in an argument with somebody, right, and you get into a debate about something, right, about the economy or about whatever, right, immediately you have all these walls built up because you know that they are arguing a specific viewpoint that you disagree with. And so this is part of the problem with arguing at all, is that you are in this conflict with somebody else about what you guys believe about the world. So rather than going into that and immediately picking sides, stories allow people to be more empathetic and watch a character have to struggle with legitimate reality and beliefs that they hold. And so then that allows you as the viewer or the reader to not have these walls in between you and this story, and you're able to just take a ride with the characters. Now, you may get to the end of that story and realize that you don't agree with the conclusions that the story makes, or that the character, or the choices that the characters make, or what the story is saying about the world. But you're able to take that journey and be legitimately invested because your ego is not being attacked by somebody who's debating with you about something, right? And so when people talk about what is the importance of storytelling, what is the importance of doing any of this, I think a lot of times we've lost what that is because we exist in a world where our predominant stories take millions and millions of dollars to produce. And so when you're in that situation, you end up focusing heavily on what sells, what is marketable, and you start to lose out on, literature, the reason stories exist. And we end up with this confusion about why stories exist and what your goal should be as a storyteller. And so, I don't think that means we should abandon filmmaking. What I think that means is that we should be doing this right here. We should be saying, hey, let's remember why stories exist. Let's remember that we can use this awesome medium of filmmaking and television to actually tell interesting, impactful stories, and to examine and realize that there are interesting and impactful stories out there, and that you have a story inside of you because you are a person that lives in conflict, that has to deal with their own philosophical beliefs and their own moral and ethical dilemmas. And you have to figure out how to live as a human being, right? And so that's really what stories are about. Stories are about how to live as a human being. And so in this podcast, that's what I'm going to be talking about: how to live as a human being in relation to being a writer and being a storyteller. How do you examine the world and examine yourself and examine worldviews and belief systems and all of this stuff in a way that you can actually be aware of certain things and apply it correctly to storytelling? So that's what we're here for, right? That's what this podcast is for. That's what I want to do. And that's what I think that a lot of writing just misses thinking, and it misses the work, right? You go to any film school and they're going to teach you about story theory. You're going to learn about structure. You're going to learn about characters. You're going to learn about conflict. But they're not going to teach you what to do when you get on page 40 of a screenplay and you hate it so much and you're like, I'll just write something else. And then you do that and you never finish a screenplay. They're not really helping you do that. They're just like, oh, well, you just have to write. Just write. You'll hear that all the time. Just write it. But people don't do that. People get 40 pages in and quit. And then people will say, oh, well, I just need an interesting concept. I need an interesting concept so that I can get this thing sold and I can become a millionaire screenwriter. And like, that's fine. I have no problem with people who want to be, millionaire screenwriters. I want to be a millionaire screenwriter, That's the goal. Who doesn't want to make $50 million writing screenplays and be the next Aaron Sorkin? That's fantastic. I would love that to happen. But the way that you get there is not by trying to make these super marketable movies and that be your entire legacy as a writer, right? Like, of course you want to make money, but you also want to impact people's lives. And the way that you impact people's lives is not just trying to find cool, interesting sci-fi concepts to throw at them. You want to find moral and philosophical ideas that you are struggling with, that you can bring to another person and say, hey, here's what I'm struggling with in the world. Here's what I don't get about life. And here's what I'm trying to figure out. And here is a way for me to present that to you as a viewer without having to have like an argument about that. Does that make sense? So that's what I want to do, and you need to be able to think about how to think, right? Like that's what I want to do. As a writer, you're thinking about thinking, because writing is nothing but thinking clearly, right? Because when things are in your head, they aren't real, right? They're not real until you can push them out of you and organize them in a way that they can actually be beneficial and helpful to yourself or to someone else, right? By writing, you start to understand what you actually think. And so going through that process is, one, good for your worldview and your personal philosophy and personal worldview. And it also allows you to share yourself and your struggles and your beliefs with another person, right? And so that's what you want to get to. And then really, the skin of your story is going to be your sci-fi concept, or is going to be your genre, or is going to be the external conflict taking place in your story. But that is not the core of your story. That's not the heart of your story. And the heart of your story is going to be the philosophical conflict. And the heart of the philosophical conflict in your story comes from you and comes from what you are thinking about and the things that you struggle with in life. So there's definitely going to be episodes in this where we are talking about theories and like philosophical ideas that people are not going to agree with, and that I don't even believe necessarily, right? But the idea is that it's going to force you to think about what you believe on a particular idea. And ideally through that process, you start to sharpen your own mind and start to realize that as a writer, you have to slowly pull away from the people who have taught you things in the world. And you have to get to a point where the things that you believe, as much as possible, are things that you have reasoned through and thought about and decided on for yourself as an individual. And the only way you're ever going to write something that people legitimately remember over 100 years or 1,000 years is by going through this process and getting to your as clear of a worldview as you can on your own. And everybody starts out in a society and a culture, and everybody is influenced by the beliefs that the people around them hold. And the goal The goal is not necessarily to leave all of that. It's not necessarily to leave your culture and leave your religion or leave your worldview. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that you have to be the one that gets to that position. You have to be the one that you're not holding ideas because people hold them. And as long as you're doing that, it's going to be really hard for you to be a writer, because it's really hard to build true philosophical dilemmas if you are not going through philosophical dilemmas on your own. So hopefully that makes sense. But that's going to be what this podcast is about. This podcast is going to be ultimately about thinking. That's why it's called The Writer's Mind. This is a podcast about thinking and about how to apply your thinking to your writing. So there's going to be episodes where I'm just talking out of a philosophy book. There's going to be episodes where we potentially talk about something that's happening in the world or that has happened in history, and we talk about the morality of certain things. And I think there's going to be a lot of good discussion because of that. And I think there's going to be a lot of good disagreement. And I think there's going to be a lot of people that are forced to start that journey of like really thinking about what they believe because they disagree heavily with me about something. And I think that'll be good, because I'm just trying to start this process, and that's how this is going to be. So, the one thing I wanted to talk about in this episode, that was really kind of the big intro, right? That's what this is going to be about. And I want to talk about one thing very quickly that I've been focused on the last month or so, that I've really thought about, and I really want you to think about as you're going into your own writing. And that is that genius, this idea of genius, this idea of like what is highly intelligent, is almost always simplicity, right? Stupidity is messiness and overcomplication, right? So when you are looking at a screenplay that you're trying to rewrite, or you're trying to figure out a philosophical dilemma in your story, everybody wants to make things super complicated. Everybody wants to say, oh, like this screenplay handles these 10 things really well, and it goes through this and it goes through this, but in reality, that's pretty difficult to do and almost never is done well. Really, what great stories do, memorable stories that we hold for decades and hundreds of years, even thousands of years, is they're really focused on simple concepts. And rather than trying to add more to your story or to your philosophical conflict, a lot of times you need to focus and simplify and bring things down and look at just a few things that aren't working. And that is what I feel like I see again and again and again, is that people are trying to make something so complicated. I see this in sci-fi stories all the time. They want to make this the most complicated sci-fi time travel concept they can possibly make, and then they just have a bland story. And then you also have the other side where you have people making like experimental indie films, and they're trying to make them so complicated that they say nothing. On the other hand, you also have this problem where people go so simplistic where they're not actually handling anything. And so that's something that you see a lot too, where a story is so basic and so simplistic that it's just so paint by numbers, and it's not a challenge at all. And that's the thing. It's not necessarily about creating an overly complex story, but it's about handling an idea that is legitimately unresolved, right? That's what it is. And stories, there's a lot of like good guy, bad guy stories that are out there. And what happens is they never veer from that. These are the good guys. These are the bad guys. Clearly, this is the good thing. Clearly, this is the good moral view. Clearly, this is the bad moral view. And that's the end of the story. And that's what that's what the people making those like experimental films are reacting against, because they see that and they're like, oh, well, I don't want to make that. That's garbage. That's so vapid and surface level that I want to do something interesting. And so then what happens is they have this reaction against structure, or they have this reaction against the good guys versus bad guys. And then they end up making terrible movies, because rather than taking these principles of storytelling and applying them to a truly legitimate philosophical dilemma that they themselves aren't sure what the answer is, and they themselves are legitimately struggling through, they just make this mashed up piece of experimental garbage that everybody has their own interpretation on, right? And that, I don't really, I could be wrong, but I don't really believe in this idea that a story should have 1,000 interpretations, that every person walking out of a theater saw something different. I think what that usually means is that you had a storyteller who didn't explain what they were trying to do well enough. I really think that you should have discussion and you should have different points of view, but that should all be centralized around this one idea that the film was talking about. So it's not about having all these interpretations. It's about, okay, we all understand that this is what was happening in this film. This is what the film was saying. Now, do we agree or disagree? Was this film handling that correctly, or was it not? Is there a more nuanced version of what the idea is that we should take a look at, or are they completely off base, or did they go in a wrong direction, or did they not handle all of the different elements of this central idea with enough credibility? That happens a lot, where you'll have a story be so slanted in the protagonist's favor that then suddenly you have a bad guy, good guy story again, and everybody is like, this is just surface level. And so it's about that's what you should look for. When people talk about open-ended stories, ideally you want a story that is open-ended in the sense that the audience they're not always in agreement on who's right about something, right? You have people leave a theater and they say, oh, well, I think the choice that he made isn't necessarily the correct one. And even though he had reasons for it, I would actually say this. That's completely different than all these people being like, oh, I thought this movie was about this. And the other person saying, oh, well, I thought it was about this. And the other person saying, oh, well, I thought it was about this. You don't want people thinking your story is about all these different things. You want them to be clear about what the story is about, but they can have different points of view on whether or not your story handled that thing with legitimacy or not. Does that make sense? So that's the big difference. And that's what I want to focus on as in this podcast, is that you want to build stories around central ideas. You don't want them to be completely up to interpretation. People can have different points of views, but that's different than there just being a million interpretations on what your story is about. And so I hope that gives you a taste of what this podcast is going to be about and what you can look forward to over the next weeks. So there's going to be a podcast every single week coming right here to the YouTube channel if you're watching there, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And also there's going to be one extra episode every week available on the Patreon. Also on the Patreon, there's going to be a Discord where you can submit questions and topics to be talked about on the podcast. So if you're interested in getting 4 extra episodes a month and you want to get questions answered or topics talked about on this podcast, then check the top link of the description on YouTube, or go to patreon.com/thewritersmind, and I'll see you in the Discord. And I hope you enjoy the Patreon episodes. Right now, as this one is up, there are already 2 extra Patreon episodes available on the Patreon. So if you enjoyed this and you enjoyed the next episode that is right here for free, then check that out. But I hope you like this, and I will see you in the next episode.